A man can disappear without ever leaving his land. That was something Elias Boone learned slowly, one quiet year at a time, standing on the same weathered porch at the edge of a valley that had once known his name. 20 years earlier, riders used to stop at his gate for water, neighbors used to wave from the road, and the valley lights used to glow warm at night. But seasons passed, fences leaned, and people moved on, until the old rancher and his worn two-story house became just another shape against the hills. Every morning Elias Boone woke before sunrise, poured coffee into the same chipped mug, and sat where the first light touched the valley floor, listening to the wind drift through the cottonwoods like a voice that almost remembered him. The valley was wide, stretching miles across dusty grass and broken fences, and on most days the only movement came from a pair of slow cattle wandering near the creek, half a mile away. Elias did not complain about the silence. Silence was honest. Silence did not pretend to remember you when it didn't. He simply worked the small pieces of land that still answered to his hands, fixing posts, mending wire, and talking sometimes to the old bay horse in the barn as if the animal understood more than most people ever had. On that particular morning the air carried the dry smell of sun-baked earth, and Elias Boone stepped down from his porch with a hammer in one hand, heading toward the front gate where the hinge had loosened again during the night wind. The gate sagged like it had grown tired of holding its place in the world. Elias set the hammer against the wood and leaned his shoulder into the post, squinting out across the valley as the sun climbed over the far ridge. At first he thought the blur on the horizon was just dust rising from the dry road 3 miles away. Dust did that sometimes when the wind changed direction. But the dust didn't drift like wind. It moved steady, purposeful. Elias Boone straightened slowly, shading his eyes with the brim of his old hat as the shapes inside that dust began to form. Horses. Riders. Not one rider either. Several. Maybe more than several. They appeared along the ridge line like dark figures cut out of the morning light. Their horses stepping carefully down the slope that led toward the narrow road running past his forgotten ranch. Elias Boone had not seen riders approach his land in years. Travelers avoided this part of the valley now. The towns had shifted west, and the new rail line ran 30 miles north, leaving his stretch of land outside the maps most people bothered to follow. Yet there they were, silhouettes against the rising sun, moving toward the road that would pass directly in front of his gate. Elias rested both hands on the fence post, feeling the old wood under his palms as a quiet thought settled into his mind, the kind of thought that arrives before a man fully understands why. Riders did not come this far unless they were looking for something. And in a valley that had forgotten his name, Elias Boone could think of only one place left for them to stop. The riders remained small against the bright ridge, but Elias Boone could already tell they were not drifting travelers. Travelers wandered. These riders moved with the quiet certainty of people who knew exactly where the road would take them. Elias rested his elbows on the top rail of the fence and watched the dust follow their horses down the slope in a long pale ribbon. The valley had been silent for years, the kind of silence that grows comfortable around a man who has stopped expecting company. Some mornings Elias would stand in the same place and imagine that if he listened carefully enough, he might still hear the echo of voices from another time. Neighbors laughing near the creek, wagons creaking along the road, children chasing each other through the tall grass. Those sounds had faded slowly, the way old paint fades from a barn wall, until only the wind remained. Elias Boone had once known nearly every rancher within 20 miles. Back then the valley was alive with smoke from cook fires and lantern light glowing through cabin windows after sunset. But railroads moved people away, drought pushed families west, and year by year the valley emptied until Elias Boone found himself the last man still fixing fences that no one else even noticed. He did not resent the quiet. In truth, he had chosen it long ago. After Martha died, the house felt too large for one man and the town too full of memories that followed him down every street. So he stayed here where the land still recognized his footsteps and the mornings arrived clean and uncomplicated. The old ranch was smaller now than it had once been. Only a few cattle grazed the pasture, and the north barn leaned slightly after a winter storm 5 years earlier. But Elias kept everything in working order out of habit. Habit had a way of holding a life together when the world around it kept moving on. He repaired boards, cleared brush, and every Sunday morning he polished the small silver frame that held Martha's photograph on the shelf beside the kitchen window. From that window, he could see the same ridge where the riders were now descending, their figures growing clearer with every minute. Elias pushed his hat back slightly and narrowed his eyes. There were more of them than he first thought. 6 perhaps, maybe 8. Their horses stepped carefully down the rocky path that wound through the dry hillside, and the sunlight flashed against something bright at one rider's shoulder. The road that passed his ranch stretched straight for 3 miles before turning toward the old creek crossing. Anyone following that road would see his gate. Anyone following that road would pass close enough to wave if they wished. Elias Boone felt a strange stirring in his chest that he could not quite name. It had been a long time since strangers approached his land. Most people believed this valley had nothing left worth visiting. Yet the riders continued toward the road without hesitation, their silhouettes steady against the morning sky. And Elias Boone suddenly understood that silence has a way of ending when a story that was never truly finished begins to find its way back home. The riders drew closer to the valley road, and Elias Boone could now see the slow rhythm of their horses moving through the morning dust. The distance between them and the ranch was still nearly a mile, but the shapes were clearer now, tall figures seated steady in their saddles, guiding their horses with quiet confidence rather than haste. Elias remained leaning against the fence rail, watching the way their path followed the natural bend of the road that curved gently toward the front of his land. No wagon tracks followed them, no herd behind them, just riders and the long stretch of empty country that rolled for miles under the rising sun. For a long moment Elias wondered if they would pass without stopping. Travelers sometimes crossed the valley on their way to somewhere else, and perhaps these riders were simply following the old road toward the creek crossing 5 miles east. But something about the way they rode suggested otherwise. Their pace was steady and deliberate, not wandering, not uncertain. They rode like people who had already decided where the road would end. Elias Boone straightened from the fence and picked up the hammer he had set down earlier, though he did not return to the loose hinge on the gate. Instead, he stood quietly, the tool resting in his hand while his eyes followed the riders as they reached the valley floor. Now the sunlight caught the colors on their clothing, and Elias noticed details he had not seen from the ridge. The riders wore broad hats and long riding coats that moved with the wind across the open grass. One horse carried a small leather pack tied neatly behind the saddle. Another rider held a staff that reflected a quick flash of light when the sun touched it. None of them appeared hurried. None of them appeared lost. The road between them and the ranch stretched straight for nearly half a mile now, and Elias Boone realized that if they continued along it, there would be only one place to stop before the creek crossing. His gate stood alone beside the road like a quiet question waiting for an answer. Elias Boone had learned over many years that the land often told a story long before the people in it spoke a word. The way someone rode a horse, the way dust followed behind them, the way their shoulders remained steady in the saddle all revealed something about their purpose. These riders carried themselves with calm intention, the kind that belonged to people who were not afraid of arriving where they were headed. Elias set the hammer down on the top rail of the fence and removed his hat for a moment, brushing the dust from the brim with the side of his hand. A light wind crossed the valley, stirring the dry grass and carrying the faint smell of warm earth from the pasture. Somewhere behind the barn the old bay horse shifted inside its stall, sensing movement in the distance long before most animals would notice. Elias replaced his hat and stepped slowly toward the gate, resting his hand on the worn wood as the riders approached the final stretch of road. The valley had been quiet for so long that even the smallest change felt like a ripple across still water. Now the riders were close enough that Elias could hear the soft rhythm of hooves against packed dirt, steady and patient as they followed the road toward his land. And as the first rider lifted his head and looked directly toward the ranch house, standing alone against the morning sky, Elias Boone felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest that these riders had not crossed miles of empty country by accident. The riders slowed as they reached the straight stretch of road that ran past the front of Elias Boone's land, their horses settling into an easy walk as if the long miles behind them had never been hurried. From where he stood beside the gate, Elias could now see their faces more clearly beneath the shade of their hats. Their expressions carried the quiet focus of travelers who had crossed wide country without complaint. The first rider lifted one hand slightly, guiding his horse toward the fence line that marked the edge of the ranch. The others followed without speaking, spreading out along the road in a loose line that allowed their horses to breathe after the descent from the ridge. Dust drifted slowly behind them, and then settled again over the grass. Elias Boone rested his hands on the top rail of the gate, and watched them approach the way a man watches a storm cloud moving across distant hills, calm on the outside, while quietly measuring what it might bring. When the riders came within 30 yards of the gate, the lead horse stopped on its own, as if it had reached a place already chosen long before the morning began. The man in the saddle studied the ranch house, standing several hundred feet back from the road, its weathered boards glowing pale in the sunlight. For a moment, none of them spoke. The valley held its breath in that silence, the same deep quiet that had surrounded Elias Boone for years. Then the rider turned his gaze toward the old rancher himself. His eyes were steady and thoughtful, the kind that noticed small things such as a loose hinge on a gate or the careful repairs along an aging fence line. Elias Boone gave a small nod of greeting. Nothing formal, just the simple acknowledgement that travelers often exchanged in wide country, where strangers might share a road for many miles before learning each other's names. The rider returned the nod with the same quiet respect. Up close, Elias noticed that the horses were well cared for despite the long journey. Their coats were brushed clean, their reins neatly tied, and each saddle carried only what was necessary for the trail. These were not careless travelers. These were riders who understood distance. One of the men farther back glanced toward the ranch house, and then toward the pasture beyond the barn, where a few cattle grazed near the slow bend of the creek. Another rider adjusted the leather strap, holding a small pack behind his saddle, the movement calm and practiced. Elias Boone felt the strange awareness again that these riders had not arrived here by chance. The lead rider finally spoke, his voice carrying across the open air with the steady tone of someone used to long roads and patient horses. He asked if this was the Boone Ranch. Elias Boone answered that it had been called that for many years. The rider studied him for a moment longer, as if confirming something he had expected to find. The wind moved softly across the grass between them, lifting the dust along the road and carrying the scent of dry sage from the hills. Then the rider said a quiet sentence that made Elias Boone feel the past shift slightly beneath his feet, because the man explained that they had come a long way to find the rancher who once helped a traveler on this road many years ago, and they hoped the man they were looking for was still standing at this gate. The wind moved softly across the valley after the rider finished speaking, carrying his words through the quiet space between the road and the old wooden gate. Elias Boone did not answer right away. The sentence lingered in the air the way dust lingers after hooves pass along a dry road. For a moment, he simply studied the man in the saddle, measuring the calm patience in his eyes and the steady posture of someone who had ridden a long distance with a purpose already decided. Many years had passed since travelers last asked for him by name. Most people who crossed this valley no longer knew the history of the land or the people who once lived upon it. Elias Boone slowly rested both hands on the top rail of the gate, the wood warm beneath his palms from the rising sun. He considered the rider's words carefully, turning them over in his thoughts like a stone found in a river that once ran stronger than it did now. A traveler on this road many years ago. The memory stirred faintly, like the distant echo of a voice carried across water. Elias Boone had helped many travelers once upon a time. The old road had been busy in those days, wagons rolling past with families seeking new land, ranch hands searching for work, traders moving between towns that have since faded from most maps. Helping a traveler had never seemed like anything worth remembering. In the wide country, a man shared water when he had it and pointed strangers toward the safest crossing when storms threatened the hills. That was simply how people survived the open land together. Yet the rider's tone suggested something more than a passing kindness remembered by chance. The other riders remained quietly behind their leader, their horses standing relaxed but attentive along the road. One of them glanced toward the distant ridge as if measuring the miles they had already crossed to reach this place. Another rested his hand lightly on the horn of his saddle while observing the ranch house that stood several hundred feet beyond the gate. None of them seemed impatient. They waited the way people wait when they know the moment they came for is finally close. Elias Boone lifted his eyes toward the far pasture where the slow creek curved through the grass. The water there moved quietly, reflecting the pale sky above the valley. For many years that creek had been the only sound keeping the ranch company through the long afternoons. Now the valley felt different somehow, as though the land itself recognized that something unfinished had returned to the road outside the gate. Elias Boone looked back at the rider and gave a thoughtful nod. His voice was calm when he spoke, carrying the steady rhythm of a man who had spent most of his life talking more with the land than with crowds. He said that a long time ago many people had passed along this road, and he had tried to help when he could, but he was not certain which traveler the rider might be remembering. The rider listened closely, then reached slowly into the small leather pouch tied beside his saddle. His movement was unhurried, respectful, the way a person handles something that carries meaning beyond its size. When he withdrew his hand, it held a small object that caught the sunlight with a brief silver flash. Elias Boone felt his breath pause for the smallest fraction of a second because even from where he stood he recognized the shape of that silver piece. And with it came the quiet realization that some moments from the past do not disappear at all. They simply travel long roads before finding their way back. The small silver object rested quietly in the rider's palm, reflecting the morning sunlight in a way that seemed almost too bright for something so small. Elias Boone felt the years between that moment and the present begin to fold inward, like pages of an old book turning back toward a chapter he had not opened in a very long time. From where he stood beside the gate, he could now see the piece clearly. It was a silver necklace, pendant shaped like a narrow crescent, worn smooth along the edges from years of use. Elias Boone knew that shape. He had seen it once before, many seasons ago, on a cold evening when the valley wind carried the smell of distant rain and a traveler had arrived at his gate with tired eyes and a horse that had nearly reached the end of its strength. The memory came slowly at first, as if the land itself were uncovering it layer by layer. Elias remembered that evening because it had been late autumn and the road had already begun to empty for the winter months. Most wagons had passed through weeks earlier, leaving the valley quiet except for a few late travelers trying to reach the next town before the colder winds arrived. That traveler had been different. He had not asked for much. Only water for his horse and a place to rest for a short while before continuing east toward the distant hills. Elias Boone had given him both without thinking much about it. That was simply the way people treated strangers in those days. The traveler had spoken little, but before he left he had taken the silver necklace from around his own neck and pressed it gently into Elias Boone's hand. Elias had refused at first, believing that kindness did not require payment, but the traveler had insisted with a quiet seriousness that Elias did not fully understand at the time. He had said that sometimes the smallest help on a long road could mean more than the person offering it might ever realize. Elias Boone had eventually accepted the necklace and placed it inside the house, not as a reward, but as a reminder that even the most ordinary day might hold a moment worth remembering. Now, standing beside the gate all these years later, Elias looked at the same silver pendant resting in the rider's hand and felt the past settle into place like a door quietly closing behind him. The rider watched Elias carefully, noticing the shift in his expression as recognition finally reached his eyes. The man nodded slowly, as if confirming a story that had traveled a great distance before arriving at this quiet valley. The other riders remained still, their horses calm and patient beneath them. One of the younger riders leaned slightly forward in the saddle, studying Elias Boone with open curiosity. The valley wind brushed softly through the grass again, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and distant sage across the road. The rider with the pendant spoke gently, explaining that the traveler Elias Boone had once helped had returned home safely because of that small kindness. Years had passed since that night, but the story had been told many times within the rider's family. They had crossed many miles of country to find the rancher who had shown that kindness without asking for anything in return. Elias Boone looked from the pendant to the quiet line of riders waiting on the road and felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, because for the first time in many years he understood that the valley might have forgotten his name, but somewhere beyond those distant hills there were still people who remembered the man who once stood beside this gate. The silver pendant rested quietly in the rider's hand for a long moment before he closed his fingers around it again, as if the memory it carried had already done the work it came to do. Elias Boone remained beside the gate, the morning sunlight warming the boards of the fence beneath his palms, while the valley wind drifted softly through the grass around them. For many years Elias had believed that small acts disappeared as quickly as dust on a long road. A man helped someone, the traveler rode on, and the world kept turning without ever looking back. That was the way the frontier usually worked. People crossed paths for a few minutes, and then the land stretched wide between them again. Yet the riders in front of him had crossed miles of open country simply to return a memory that Elias himself had nearly forgotten. The lead rider placed the pendant back into the leather pouch beside his saddle and gave a slow nod, as though the purpose of the long journey had now been confirmed. He explained that the traveler Elias once helped had been his father. At the time, the man had been riding through unfamiliar country with little food left for himself or his horse, trying to reach family waiting far beyond the eastern hills. Without the water and rest Elias had offered that night, the journey might have ended before morning. Instead, the traveler had reached home safely, and from that day forward, he spoke often about the quiet rancher who had helped him without expecting anything in return. Elias Boone listened to the words with a stillness that came from deep reflection rather than surprise. The past had a way of returning when the land was ready to reveal it again. One of the younger riders stepped forward slightly, guiding his horse a few feet closer to the gate. His expression held a respectful curiosity, as if he had grown up hearing the story but had never expected to stand on the same road where it began. The lead rider gestured gently toward the ranch house in the distance and said that his father had always remembered the place where the help was given. The wooden porch, the quiet pasture, the old gate beside the road. Those details had been described so clearly over the years that when the riders reached the valley that morning they recognized the ranch immediately. Elias Boone followed the rider's gesture and looked toward his house, the same house he had repaired board by board through seasons of wind and dust. For a moment he saw it through different eyes, not as the lonely place the valley had forgotten, but as a landmark carried in someone else's memory for decades. The riders remained calm along the road, their horses resting easily beneath them while the sunlight climbed higher over the hills. The lead rider then spoke again, his voice steady and warm with quiet meaning. He said that the family had come not only to return the necklace, but to honor the kindness behind it. A long journey deserved a proper ending, and gratitude deserved to be delivered in person. Elias Boone felt the weight of those words settle gently over the quiet ranch. For many years he believed the valley had erased his story from the land. But standing there beside the gate with riders who had traveled across miles to find him, Elias Boone realized something simple and powerful at the same time. Sometimes the world does remember. It simply takes the long road to say thank you. The valley remained quiet after the rider finished speaking, the kind of deep quiet that makes a man aware of every small sound carried across open land. Elias Boone stood beside the gate and looked at the line of horses resting along the road, their shadows stretching across the pale dust under the rising sun. For a moment he did not know what to say. Gratitude was a strange thing to receive after so many years of believing that the world had already turned its attention somewhere else. The lead rider watched him patiently, the way someone waits for an old story to settle into its final meaning. Then he guided his horse a few steps closer to the gate and continued speaking. He explained that when his father returned home that long ago autumn, the story of the quiet rancher had traveled far beyond their own household. It had been told beside campfires, shared during long winter nights, and remembered each time someone spoke about the kindness that strangers sometimes find on the open road. Over the years the story became something more than a memory. It became a reminder that a small act of help could carry farther than the person offering it might ever see. The rider said that before his father passed away, he had given one final request to the family. He asked that one day someone should ride back to the valley and find the man who had once offered water, rest, and a place beside the fire without asking for anything in return. The rider paused for a moment and looked around at the quiet ranch, the barn, the pasture, and the wooden house that had stood through decades of wind and sun. He said that his father believed the man who helped him might still be here, tending the same land with the same quiet patience. And if that man could be found, the family should make sure he understood that kindness had never been forgotten. The younger rider shifted slightly in his saddle and nodded toward the house, clearly impressed by the way the ranch still stood strong against the years. Another rider reached into a saddlebag and withdrew a small cloth bundle tied neatly with leather cord. He handed it forward to the lead rider, who leaned down and extended it toward Elias Boone across the top rail of the gate. Elias accepted the bundle slowly, feeling its surprising weight in his hands. Inside the cloth were several polished tools made of strong steel and a folded letter written carefully in steady handwriting. The rider explained that the tools were meant to help keep the ranch strong for many more seasons, and the letter carried the words his father wished to deliver himself if time had allowed it. Elias Boone held the bundle and looked once more at the riders gathered quietly along the road. The wind moved gently through the grass again, and the valley that had felt so empty for many years now seemed filled with something else entirely. It was not noise or excitement. It was something quieter and stronger than that. It was the simple knowledge that even the smallest kindness given on a long road can travel farther than a man ever expects, and sometimes it returns many miles later in ways he never imagined. For a long time Elias Boone did not move. He stood beside the gate holding the cloth bundle while the morning sun climbed slowly above the ridge and spread warm light across the valley floor. The riders waited with quiet patience, their horses resting easily as though they understood that this moment belonged to the man standing at the fence. Elias finally untied the leather cord and unfolded the cloth with careful hands. The steel tools inside shone softly in the sunlight, strong and well made, the kind a rancher could depend on for many seasons of work. Beneath them lay the folded letter. Elias Boone turned the paper over once before opening it, feeling the rough grain of the page beneath his fingers. The handwriting inside was steady and thoughtful, each word written with the care of someone who had carried those thoughts for a long time. The letter spoke of the night a traveler had arrived tired and uncertain beside a quiet ranch gate. It spoke of the water that had been offered, the fire that had been shared, and the simple kindness that allowed a man to continue a journey that meant everything to his family waiting far away. The writer explained that many years had passed, yet the memory of that kindness remained as clear as the road beneath a bright morning sky. He wrote that a man may travel thousands of miles in his lifetime, but he never forgets the place where someone helped him when he needed it most. Elias Boone lowered the letter slowly when he reached the final line. The wind moved gently through the grass around the ranch, carrying the same quiet sound that had filled his days for so many years. But now that quiet felt different. It no longer felt empty. The lead rider watched him with a calm expression and gave a respectful nod. He explained that their journey was nearly finished now. They had delivered the message their father wished to send and returned the necklace that had once marked the moment two strangers shared a brief kindness on a long road. The younger riders looked around the ranch with quiet admiration before gently turning their horses back toward the open valley. Elias Boone folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the cloth along with the tools. Then he rested his hands once more on the wooden gate and looked across the land that had been his home for most of his life. The riders began guiding their horses back toward the road that led to the distant hills, their silhouettes slowly growing smaller against the wide sky. Elias Boone watched them ride away until the dust of their passing settled once more across the quiet valley. For many years, he believed the world had forgotten the man who stood beside this gate. Yet as he turned toward the house and the long work waiting in the fields, Elias Boone carried a quiet understanding with him. Sometimes the world remembers in ways a man cannot see at first. Sometimes a simple kindness travels farther than the road itself, and when it returns, it brings with it the truth that no good deed is ever truly lost in the wide open land.